The dusty dirt clumped against Joseph's sandals. He gathered up that old but very fine woolen coat in his gold-clad hands and sat down, dangling his tanned legs over the side of the pit, bored deep, deep into the ground. It was dark and dry. It was hard to see the bottom, although he knew from experience that inside it, snakes slithered and scorpions crawled silently in search of their prey. Just sitting by that pit was to sit with his pain. Joseph remembered eagerly he went to find his brothers that long ago day at his father's bidding. And he knew, of course, even then, that they hated him. He knew they despised his dreams. They were jealous of his coat. They lusted after their father's love, which shone upon Joseph like the warmth of the sun. And for all of that, for all of those reasons that they convinced themselves were righteous, his brothers threw him into this pit in the ground and left him there to die. But all of that was in the past now. As one of the most powerful men in Pharaoh's court, Joseph lived a lavish life of comfort. Reunited with his father, reconciled with his brothers, we can imagine Joseph and his whole family living safely and prosperously together in Egypt for the rest of Jacob's life, a long life that ends in this week's Torah portion at the ripe old age of 147. Returning to Egypt after burying his father in Machpelah, the one in the Middle East, not the one in Ferndale, though that is where it got its name, we learn from our Midrash that Joseph stopped to look inside the pit. What pit? The very same pit into which his brothers cast him so many years before. Having risen, really soared to unbelievable heights, why on earth would Joseph return to the pit that day? Joseph's story, for all its dreamlike grandeur, this cast of characters and action-packed family drama, is also the story of just one pit. A hole in the ground, holy ground, if you will, a bad place, a dark and painful place, but one that is important to Joseph, to his past, to his present, and to his future. We learn from our patriarch, who was able to rise above it, that it's really what you do with the story of your time in the darkness that can truly change your life. And now, speaking of Jacob's ability to rise above it, I want to turn to another saga that many of us have gotten to know very well. These past 6 weeks, the Lader household, along with much of America, has been wholly and completely obsessed with Wicked. Yeah. The music plays literally on repeat in the car and has since Thanksgiving, including throughout every single minute of our road trip to the East Coast during this past winter break to visit our family. And I do know from the sheer number of you who sent me the video of those two cantors in New York singing their popular version of Adon Olam that you're with me, or at least you know me well. Now, I'm confident that the reason Wicked has taken the world by storm more than 20 years after its debut as a Broadway musical isn't only due to their incredible marketing team. It's because Wicked is not just catchy songs and celebrities and TikTok dance routines. Beneath its spellbinding melodies lies a narrative as old as the Torah itself. It's a story of scapegoating, of dehumanization, and the moral cost of branding someone as the other. It is, in essence, a deeply Jewish tale. At its heart, Wicked reimagines the Wizard of Oz from the perspective of Elphaba, the so-called Wicked Witch of the West. You might say it's modern Midrash at its finest. It fills in the blanks. It offers stories and voices that are otherwise absent from the original text. And there are so many parallels to our Torah portion this week, not the least of which is the fact that both of these stories ended up as beloved Broadway smash hits. Where Joseph was ostracized by his brothers because of his natural gifts and his father's favoritism, Elphaba is ridiculed by her father and everybody else, labeled as an outsider from the moment she enters the world. And both have real power. Joseph's visions eventually lead him to a place of honor and wealth. Elphaba's incredible talent should have done the same, but instead, her insistence on ethical leadership wreaks havoc. She becomes the scapegoat for all of Oz's troubles, a tragic figure which mirrors the Jewish experience across millennia. But it's the pit that truly captures my imagination. the darkness that engulfed both Joseph and Elphaba by the hands of the people who were supposed to guide them and love them and protect them. And I'm really intrigued by the fact that neither looks away. Joseph returns to the pit. He peers into the depths, remembering the most difficult time in his life. Elphaba draws from her own persecution to fight for justice and to lend her own voice to the silenced in the story. There's a teaching that I love in our tradition that we're supposed to recite blessings over the bad things that happen in our lives, as well as the good stuff, that we should learn to accept the challenges alongside our joy. When the rabbis ask, "How can this be?" our sage, Rava, responds that our limited vision doesn't allow us to know with any certainty what is good and what is bad, despite how things may seem. Rava asks the rabbis to think about a flood that covers their land. How could this possibly be good? Because, he answers, this land is covered with rich minerals and sediment and becomes more fertile for future generations. And when we look at the book of Genesis for just a second, we find our text is just riddled with this idea. From Adam and Eve, who deal with the trauma of expulsion from the Garden of Eden and have to learn to live a new life after being exiled from everything they know, to Noah, who has to literally rebuild our world after it's destroyed by a flood, to Abraham, who God commands, "Lech lecha," go forth from everything you know and rebuild a new life in a place you've never been, to Isaac, who's almost sacrificed by his own father. The list goes on and on. Genesis is this collection of stories about family trauma and the growth that must occur in its wake. And I guess if you look at it that way, Joseph returning to that pit makes sense. Visiting that dark and awful place reminds him from whence he came and what he's had to overcome to live the life he lived. To visit is to remember that resilience, to honor his ability to forgive, to offer a blessing, perhaps, over the bad in order to recognize the good. And it works for Elphaba too. Her social isolation and rejection leads to her awakening, her moral strength, her courage, her authenticity. She never forgets. She visits her pain, and it influences her decision to live the life she's lived, to be bold and brave and authentic, having learned and grown from her time on the other side. We all have moments in our lives where it seems that we too are looking up from the bottom of our own pits, where darkness and emptiness suffuse our every move. And while the paths that lead us there are all different, it's not a competition. We've all experienced suffering and despair, grief and anger. If we are lucky enough to climb our way out, it's hard to imagine then wanting to remember. But it's important to revisit the pits, the depths, our deepest and darkest moments, those painful stories of our lives, to see what we can learn from them and how we can grow. Because just like our ancestors who came before us, all of these stories of our people that we know and love and tell over and over again, when we revisit our past, when we voice our story and transform it and use it, then we can move to the next chapter of our lives, each of us having been changed for the good. Shabbat Shalom.